morning, and thank you for joining me on the Path to Liberty. I'm Michael Bolden with the 10th Amendment Center, and this is the show for Monday, August 15th, 2022. And today, probably thanks to government-run education, not many people know the name Tench Coxe. But at the time of the founding, he was actually pretty famous and actually pretty widely read as well. In fact, he was probably the most widely read or did the most writing on the individual natural right to keep and bear arms, and maybe that's one of the reasons the government-run schools don't like talking about him. Anyways, on this episode, I want to highlight some of his most important work on the right to keep and bear arms, plus the militia, standing armies, the federal structure of the Constitution, maybe a little bit even on the preamble and sovereignty, and a little bit more. But first of all, before getting to that, a quick hello and a huge thank you. Thank you so much for being here. I hope you had a great weekend. I hope your Monday is off to a good start. And I can't thank you enough for being here, whether this is your first episode or you've been here for every single one since day one. While we allow people another minute or so to join us here on the live stream and get notifications on those mainstream platforms, which are, it's great for reaching new people, but they don't always work the way that we want them to, and they're not always nice to us. But anyways, hello to everyone out in the live chat. There's Kirk in Camden, South Carolina, Cheriton Farmer in Missouri. Legal Lee says, I loves me some Tench Coxe, no doubt. Thank you for being here. Greetings from the Twin Cities. Richard Banks in Fredonia. There's Dixie Strong in Bama. Clay Kent, retired senior chief in FEMA Region 3. I'm not sure what that is, but that's where that is. But thank you for being here. Christine, Senator DT, Poet Fisherman in Iowa, Lawrence Smith, Stephen Potts, and everyone else. Leah Tanya King in Missouri, and Tennessee River Union Railroad in Florida. Thank you all for being here. I know I skipped over a few. I will look back in the chat a little bit later today. I read them over the next day or so after the live broadcast is done as well, and I get a lot of ideas for future episodes. So I appreciate your feedback, or sometimes people are challenging me on things, or they just have ideas or suggestions. So please continue leaving comments, and that does also help trigger those algorithms on those mainstream platforms, telling them to show us to more people. Anyways, let's get right to this. And I should mention, you got to follow us at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path2liberty if you want to keep up with all the episodes we've done for over 4 years. All the different platforms are on both video and audio-only podcast edition, and for each individual show, there's a blog post with a show links section where you can find all the stuff that I'm referencing in each episode, like this article from Rob Nadelson, which is an interesting overview. He said, few people know of Tench Coxe today, but during the founding era, he was famous, linking to a book on Tench in this article. You should check out all this stuff that I'm linking here or I'm mentioning. He served in the Confederation Congress, did a little bit more than that. We'll get to that in a moment. After the Constitution was ratified, he became our first Assistant Secretary of the Treasury, working directly under Alexander Hamilton. Coxe is an interesting character because there are some playing both sides, and I'm not sure if it was political or if he was changing his mind, because, of course, enlightened people do learn to change their mind over time, but some people just change their mind as the political winds blow. I'm not sure, but he did a lot of incredible work, especially on the right to keep and bear arms. Anyways, here's Rob again in another article. He said, during the ratification era, 1787 to 90, he was among the most widely read pro-Constitution writers. Like the Federalist Papers, Coxe's writings helped mold public understanding of the Constitution's meaning. I would say Coxe was actually far more influential, and as we'll see here in this episode, it's possible that Coxe actually even influenced some of the views in the Federalist, with him writing stuff, sending it along to James Madison, and then urging him to share it with Hamilton, etc., in order for them to continue sharing their views. We know the Federalist was primarily, during ratification, only influential in New York State, and they weren't really widely printed and distributed until after some of the other states had already ratified. But people like James Wilson with his State House Yard speech in October of 1787, people like Noah Webster, and here Tench Coxe, in series of essays, a number of essays in defense of the Constitution, were probably far more influential in the various states around the country in regards to ratification. Unlike the Federalist, Rob writes, Coxe's essays were written in direct, easy-to-read language, not a lot of technical stuff, and that's probably part of why it was so popular. He republished it in a newspaper, people liked it, talked about it, shared it. A little different than social today, but similar ideas. Newspapers around the country printed and reprinted them over and over and over. Now, some of his essays itemize many of the activities over which the Constitution granted the federal government little or no jurisdiction. He was a 10th Amendment guy before the 10th Amendment. As we all know, A lot of the people in support of the Constitution claim that you didn't even need to add a Bill of Rights. You didn't need a 9th or a 10th Amendment because the structure of the Constitution was of delegated and reserved powers, and if it wasn't delegated, then they couldn't do it anyway. So they took the view that even without the 10th Amendment, the Constitution had the exact same structure. The powers not delegated or reserved to the states, respectively, or to the people. That's my paraphrase real quick. Anyways, among them were social services. Coxe and many others talked about things that the federal government would have no power over. Social services like care for the poor and health care. Education would not be a federal issue. Religion, real estate, local business, most roads, and other infrastructure. All those infrastructure spending bills, some of it they can spend it on, but most of it they are not supposed to. Nearly all criminal law matters and most civil court cases. I'm going to get into a list of some of the things that Coxe specifically talked about would be outside the purview of federal power. Rob goes on, he says, when people believed government should regulate those areas, the Constitution mandated that they turn to state and local governments if they really want government to do stuff. Now, my view in general is for most situations, government needs to get the hell out of the way. But if you're talking about the structure of the Constitution, just what's factually authorized to government, if you want government to be involved in things like care for the poor, healthcare, education, real estate, local business, stuff like that, you should be looking to state and local government. That way, people can learn more quickly, and you don't have a one-size-fits-all kind of solution that never actually works for anybody if we're talking about kind of a utilitarian view, because you can't mold one view of something, one regulation that fits all the different political, economic, social, religious viewpoints of people in so many different areas, hundreds of millions of people in such a massive country. Anyways, so they should actually turn to state and local government. No fleeting national coalition should be would be permitted to dictate to the entire country. Now, I'm going to get a little bit back to that in just a minute, but first there's some interesting background with Tench Coxe. And I mentioned that he was kind of back and forth, but he also had some interesting family history. And here from Historical Society of Pennsylvania, first of all, he was born in 1755. He was only 10 when the Stamp Act was set to go into effect. Thomas Jefferson thought that the preparations for the Stamp Act in 1764, and then once they were passed in 65, and Patrick Henry's great speech and resolutions in support of opposition resisting disobedience to the Stamp Act in May of 1765, Thomas Jefferson thought that was really the beginning of the real American Revolution. John Adams thought it was a few years earlier up in Massachusetts, but this was a very, very important time. But in 1765, Tench's father, William, was appointed to the post of a stamp distributor, the number one dude, the tax collector, the Stamp Act guy for New Jersey was Tench Coxe's dad, after receiving a recommendation from Benjamin Franklin, who also wasn't good on that at first. Anyways, William did not remain long in the position, however, and resigned as a result, and this happened with many people. He was basically run out on a rail. He resigned as a result of violent colonial protests against the Stamp Acts, and after several threats were made against his own life. That was part of the strategy, was to resist and to have a little bit of mob pressure, we'll call it. Following the event, his father adopted a neutral stance in regard to colonial criticisms of the British, agreeing that the colonists had a right to question English policies, but he did not advocate independence. So that's kind of the pedigree. The Coxe family had a very long history going back to the 17th century in Pennsylvania and elsewhere, but he certainly came from his father, and we know that parents can oftentimes have a lot of influence on our views. So he started out kind of a loyalist. And they say that Tench followed in his father's footsteps in more ways than one. He adopted William's neutral attitude. I think neutral is a bit of an overstatement, to be honest with you, toward conflicts with Great Britain. I think he basically wanted to stay out of it because he wanted to do business with the British. So he was motivated by business interests. And in 1776, he became a partner in the Coxe and Furman Trade House, which was then renamed Coxe, Furman, and Coxe. Anyways, so he tried to remain neutral, but in the end, he sided with the British and abandoned his native city to live in New Jersey and New York relatives who were mostly pacifists or ardent loyalists. So he stayed in New York then until the British invaded Philadelphia in, I think it was 1777, late 77, early 78. I forget the dates on that. But soon as the British took over Philadelphia, he actually went back to Philly to kind of show his loyalist side because he wanted to do business with them, and he just thought this was the way to do it. So he started doing business in Philadelphia with the loyalists, with the supporters of the British, and he made a ton of money on that. And here from Tara Ross, once the British were ousted or they left Philly, Coxe's name was included on a list of those suspected of high treason. So they came out with a list of people. Okay, the British are gone. Here are the people, the collaborators. And Tench Coxe, who's one of the most important founding fathers, was on that list in 1778, I guess. And I think a lot of his trading success while he was in Philadelphia during the time of British occupation, that gave a lot of support to the charges that he was one of the bad guys. They actually claim that he served in the British Army, but we don't actually have any verification of that. But he was arrested. He was arrested for being a collaborator. But Coxe, Tara writes, promptly took an oath of allegiance to the United States and renounced all ties with the Tories. You gotta wonder, though, she says, if people really believed him. So it almost kind of seemed like an oath of convenience, and that's the suggestion at the time, and maybe he wasn't really on board with all of this. He's like, man, I'm just trying to live my life. You guys have your politics outside of it. I'm not sure if that was it, but there are records of him actually joining the Pennsylvania militia. I think the earliest is 1780. So within the next couple of years, he actually started to participate in the militia, and there's records all the way through then that he was actually part of that. So he did join up. He took that oath, and maybe he switched sides out of convenience. Maybe he switched sides out of experience. And that's really what Stephen Halbrook and Dave Koppel actually had to say in this great article on Tench Coxe and the right to keep and bear arms in the early republic. This is something, if you want, especially with all the debates over court cases and things like that, you really want to read this history because Coxe was so influential on the Second Amendment, the view of the Second Amendment, and the individual right to keep and bear arms. And they say whatever Coxe's attitude during the first part of the Revolution in Pennsylvania, the events of the Revolution seem eventually to have influenced his political philosophy on the issue of men and arms, because most of what he later wrote about the connection between arms and freedom was consistent with revolutionary patriot philosophy, especially in Philadelphia. For example, they write, Coxe, like the delegates who created Pennsylvania's 1776 Constitution, and like other patriots of revolutionary Pennsylvania, saw a direct connection between the right to hunt and the strength of the militia as a check on tyranny. And he talks about this all through his career. The strength of the militia, of average people having military-grade weapons in order to actually be an effective check against tyranny. Now, he was there. He saw the disarmament of the people. We know that in 1778, General Howe, I believe, disarmed the people of Philadelphia. And in Pennsylvania, throughout Pennsylvania, especially in Philadelphia, newspapers repeatedly reported on General Gage doing the same to the people of Boston a couple of years earlier. So he saw this firsthand. He was experiencing this amongst all the other people, this kind of gun control program from the British, which really led to Lexington and Concord in 75. Although it is not known how Coxe reacted to the disarmament at the time, they say, this is Halbrook and Koppel, his later writings are aligned closely with the political philosophy of vehement opposition to firearms confiscation that patriots of the time expressed in Philadelphia. So that's just an interesting kind of shows how there was a transition. And maybe it was because maybe he was a loyalist at first. Maybe he was just a businessman. I'm just going to do whatever I'm going to be able to do the most for my family and my career. And then when things got crazy, maybe he had a shift. We don't know for sure, but he certainly experienced the gun control firsthand. He watched it play out. He read about it play out in nearby Boston. And then, well, at some point there, he certainly had a shift. And then after the war, we'll just skip to after the war, he ended up being the secretary of the Pennsylvania Abolition Society. So he was anti-slavery. He was part of the Confederation or the Continental Congress and the Confederation Congress. He was, I think it was Confederation Congress. And then as a delegate in the Annapolis Convention of 1786, he was there as a precursor to the Philadelphia Convention in 1787. Now, as I mentioned earlier, He actually was one of the most widely read supporters of the Constitution. Here he is writing in October of 1787, again, talking about the right to keep and bear arms. He said, should tyranny threaten the people, he said, the firm and ardent friends to liberty may know the length to which they can push their noble opposition on the foundation of the law. So we can push our opposition, but should it get crazier, he said, should their country's cause impel them further, they will be acquainted with the hazard, and using those arms which Providence has put into their hands, will make a solemn appeal to the power above. And maybe the parlance is a little different than what we use today, but he's like, should things get really bad, the people have arms. He's not saying the people have arms as long as they're working for the government or they're from some particular organized system that the government has control over. No, the people have arms in case the government gets too crazy. And that's how Tench Coxe put it. And I know a lot of people don't like that view, but history is history, and that's what he said. Anyways, he goes on a little further talking about the militia. He said the militia, who are in fact the effective part of the people at large. The people at large are the militia. It's not just the National Guard today. I know that's how a lot of people want you to think, or it's just some collective thing. This is the people at large. He said, will render many troops quite unnecessary. And here he is, like many others, he's actually highlighting the danger of a standing army and recognizing that the individual, the natural right to keep and bear arms, the right of self-defense, the reason that people want to have high-powered weaponry is so they not just to defend against their own tyranny of their own government, not to just defend against tyranny of an invasion of another country or to be like the first line of defense ready to roll, but also to prevent what the founding generation saw as one of the greatest threats to liberty. Some saw it as the greatest threat to liberty. James Madison actually said that the greatest danger is from large permanent standing armies. But this is a tool. If everyone's armed, you don't need as much of a military force. That's the founding generation's view. And again, a lot of people don't like that one as well, but that's how the founders viewed things. But he's also pointing out that an armed population renders those standing armies really unnecessary. So he's not as concerned about them, and I'll get to that in just a moment. He said, the militia will form a powerful check upon the regular troops and will generally be sufficient to overawe them, just in strength, in numbers, or guerrilla warfare, if you really get down to it. So he sent this paper over to James Madison, encouraging him to make use of it, talking about, maybe they know that they're writing the Federalist Papers at that time, not Coxe, but Madison, Jay, and Hamilton. But here's how he put it. He said, at the request of Mr. Wilson, Dr. Rush and another friend or two and I added a fourth paper, and he's referencing the one that I was just talking about, calculated to show the general advantages and obviate some of the objections to the system, the Constitution. I wish that you and Colonel Hamilton may make use of them, which you think will serve the cause. So that's one of the indications. There are others like this, his writing back and forth to Madison, even encouraging Madison to reach out to Jefferson on various things. He's actually, in some ways, the guy behind the scenes, very influential on the Federalist. And Madison replied, he said, I have no doubt that Mr. Hamilton or Colonel Hamilton will make the best use of them. This fourth paper is a valuable continuation, and I shall be equally desirous of seeing it in the Virginia Gazettes and indeed in those of every state. So this is Madison talking about how this is the stuff that needs to be pushed out there, and this is some of the argument. One of the most important arguments to James Madison includes this view of the people, the average person being armed in large numbers, and as Patrick Henry said in Virginia, the great object is that everyone be armed. Anyways, the installment was published widely. This is Hallbrick and Copel, and the series circulated as a vital part of the national debate. And we know this because it was published all over the place. There are historical records of that. Now, back to standing armies. We know that Tench Coxe didn't like standing armies, just like everyone else. But he wasn't as concerned about them. The Anti-Federalists were like, man, you guys are including a standing army provision in this? This is extremely dangerous. George Mason, for example, said whenever a standing army is established, the people lose their liberty. But Tench Coxe, probably James Madison, and others were on the other side of the spectrum, Madison specifically as well, where they were saying, yes, we agree that standing armies are dangerous. Sometimes they're necessary. Everybody said sometimes they're necessary, but you're always going to lose liberty when you have them. But Madison and Coxe and others, and here I'll get to Coxe in just a moment, they weren't as concerned about the structure of the Constitution regarding standing armies. Why? Because everyone was going to be armed. And as long as everyone's armed, you don't have to worry about having standing armies. You won't even have to really establish them. Thomas Jefferson, when he came into office after Washington Adams, he actually cut back on the military. And Tench Coxe was part of his administration, helping arm all the militia. So Coxe got in there around 1803, so a few years in, but his job was basically getting arms to the militia. That was one of his primary duties. And here's Coxe talking about this. He said, the power of the sword, and he's responding to the Anti-Federalists in Pennsylvania, but he's saying the power of the sword, they say, is in the hands of Congress. And he's like, you may think that. He said, my friends and countrymen, it is not so, for the powers of the sword are in the hands of the yeomanry of America from 16 to 60. The militia of these free commonwealths, entitled and accustomed to their arms. So, talking about everybody from age 16 to 60 are entitled and accustomed to their arms. Entitled, it is their birthright. He's going to talk about birthright here in just a moment. Entitled and accustomed to their arms when compared with any possible army must be tremendous and irresistible. Who are the militia? Are they not ourselves? So these types of views, and Madison did not oppose them at all, these types of views really are very powerful arguments against the idea that the right to keep and bear arms, that the Second Amendment is about some collective right, some collective organization run by government. I mean, that's kind of redundant, but anyways. He said, Congress have no power to disarm the militia. The militia is all of us, and Congress has no power to disarm the militia. Straightforward stuff from Tench Coxe. And he goes further. He said, their swords. Now, he's not just talking about hunting here, again, because if this is a tool to prevent the need for a large standing army, then of course the militia has to have the type of weaponry that a military force is going to use. And he said, their swords and every other terrible implement of the soldier are the birthright of an American. It's not some gift from government. It's not something that you get a permission slip for. It's literally by the nature of your very existence of being a human being born, you have the right to every terrible implement of the soldier, according to Tench Coxe. And I know people just kind of blow that off like, oh, yeah, the military's so strong. This is dumb. I don't know. This is what the founders wanted. This is important to understand, especially if we're going to understand the original legal meaning of the Constitution. We have to understand how they understood it. And that's how they understood it, whether you like it or not. And here from Nadelson again, he said, in other words, the right to keep and bear arms includes military arms, not just hunting pieces. Rifles such as the AR-15, which are, I like that he adds this, misleadingly branded as assault weapons, are protected. Not despite the fact that they are military weapons, but precisely because they are. And I know some of you guys out there know that most American-made or American-available AR-15 are really not the same grade as military, but Rob is telling us, and Tench Coxe is telling us, that this is the point. You want the average person to be able to have access to this because you're defending yourself, you're defending liberty, you're defending your state, you're defending your family, you're defending your country, and you're defending everyone from the need for what James Madison thought was so dangerous, large standing armies. He told us that armies and debts and taxes are the known instruments for putting the many under the domination of the few. And Rob goes on, he said, Cox's view is hardly surprising to those of us who study the founders. The Revolutionary War had ended only 5 years before he was saying this type of thing. If American citizens had not possessed military weapons, we would have lost. So a lot of this was through lived experience, and certainly the opposition to standing armies throughout the 1760s, and then, of course, in Boston, the massacre of 1770, the opposition to standing armies, it was palpable, it was real, they had lived through it, and they warned us. So here from T.J. Martinelli said, this is what in regards to the ratification debates or the discussion over the proposed Bill of Rights before they were actually ratified. Coxe wrote a newspaper, TJ says, days after the Bill of Rights was introduced, describing the right to keep and bear arms as an individual right. Here's how Coxe put it. As civil rulers, not having their duty to the people before them, may attempt to tyrannize. So recognizing again, this is the same argument that the Anti-Federalists made. And I think Coxe was really an interesting character in that he didn't take just one side or the other, kind of Jeffersonian. Jefferson himself wrote in 1789, I think to Francis Hopkinson, said specifically, I'm not a Federalist. I may be closer to them. I'm also not an Anti-Federalist. If I could only go to heaven, but with a party, I would not go there at all. So finding the best parts of everything rather than having a faction-first approach is very important. And I think Coxe actually did that very much as well, unless he was just jumping from faction to faction. I don't know for sure. But he's saying, he's recognizing, like the Anti-Federalists did, that people with power just might use that power in a really bad way. He's also acknowledging that there is enough power in the proposed Constitution at that time, or in the Constitution, that they could tyrannize. Civil rulers may tyrannize. And as the military forces, he said, which must be occasionally raised to defend our country, might pervert their power to the injury of their fellow citizens, the people are confirmed by the article, the Second Amendment, in their right to keep and bear their private arms. The people themselves, this is an individual, natural right to self-defense. Now, it wasn't just the right to keep and bear arms, although that's a lot of what we talk about Tench for, is that very, very important, a primary law of nature, the right of self-defense. But he also rejected the idea that the federal government was authorized to have unlimited power, basically like today. Now, I've got a list of a few things here that he actually specifically told the people while they were actually considering ratification, no, if you're concerned, this is not something that's the federal government is authorized to do. And then it was ratified under that view in many situations. So here are some of them. With minor exceptions, ordinary criminal laws and exclusive state responsibility. Reserved to the states is jurisdiction over, quote, disorders, riots, assaults, larcenies, bigamy, arson, burglaries, murders, state treason, and many other offenses against the states. Peace and dignity, which being in no way subjected to the jurisdiction of the federal legislature. Only the states may declare the pains and penalties that shall be consequent on conviction. That's Tench Coxe talking about criminal law and all kinds of other stuff. The states would control civil justice within state boundaries. Infrastructure. This is a huge one because on both sides of the coin today, everybody wants to do infrastructure spending. That's the job of the feds. Well, absolutely not. Not under the Constitution. Some of it, of course, but not all of it. Infrastructure is almost exclusively a state function. He said general roads, anything that's not a post road. Now, post roads, of course, they pervert every term in the Constitution. They claim that it's every road that the post office can drive over. No, post roads were very specific at the time of the founding. They were kind of interstate highways. They were large thoroughfares that connected large areas, and they were marked by posts, basically mile markers. And you can see some of the original posts up in the Northeast still today from the time of the founding. So anything that was a non-post road, so basically all the roads, would be exclusive to the states. Roads, canals, bridges, clearing rivers, erecting ferries, etc. Education and religion are exclusive state responsibilities. Or if the people of the state don't want government involved at all, it's up to them. And that way you can have all these different views where people can learn much faster what works and what doesn't for their own political viewpoints. So education and religion, exclusive to the states. Only states may establish state and county schools and places of worship. Or incorporate societies for purposes of religion, learning, policy, or profit. The states enjoy exclusive jurisdiction over their internal commerce, so intrastate commerce. We hear today that the Commerce Clause means anything that might have some kind of economic component at some time, whether it crosses state lines or not, is somehow within the federal purview under the so-called Interstate Commerce Clause in Article 1, Section 8. And in fact, in the Gonzalez versus Raich case, this is the 2005, the cannabis case here in California, in dissent, Clarence Thomas basically said, if they can regulate or prohibit the growing of a plant in your own backyard that you consume in your own home, never take across state lines, never buy or sell, then their commerce power is unlimited. And really it is today. So, but Tench Coxe told us specifically when they were considering ratification, no, intrastate commerce in your own state, the feds can't even touch it. Social service, he says, and healthcare are reserved exclusively to the states, for only states may establish poorhouses and hospitals. The states retain exclusive power over inheritance and over land within their own boundaries. Now, for those of us out west, and I know people in Utah, Nevada, and elsewhere, man, it's far worse than here in California. The federal control over land is horrible. And the amount that they keep off the market for productive use is insane as well. Anyways, all of these functions, Rob writes, and this is from the Federalist Society Review. I will link to this whole 7-page paper, which is really interesting. All of those functions, as well as other items that Coxe listed elsewhere, would be exercised by the states, quote, independent of the control or interference of the federal government. I like that he specifically said if the feds get involved in this, they're interfering. We have to have that mentality. Why are you sticking your face into stuff that has none of your business? Anyways, Coxe's listing helps cement, and this is from Nadelson again, in the public mind, the most natural meaning of the text of the Constitution. It created a strictly limited central government, which, outside D.C. and the territories, had no authority over most aspects of American life. He's a really solid right to keep and bear arms Second Amendment guy, but clearly a very strong 10th Amendment guy as well. His work demonstrates clearly that the current bloated federal government, the monster state of today, was not what the American people agreed to when they ratified the Constitution. In other words, many of the current federal activities are simply illegitimate. I like that Nadelson calls it illegitimate. The founders often used the word void, and even Hamilton, when he was pretending to be one of the good guys, specifically said when they do things that are not in pursuance of the delegated powers, they're not supreme. Of course, we're told that all federal acts are supreme, but he says they are void and should be treated as such. It's essential for us to actually talk about, well, I'll get to that in another one. Anyways, Coxe first addressed the expression, this is from an article by Mike Meharry, we the people, in the preamble, talking about sovereignty and final authority and things like that, calling the phrase a mere form of words. A lot of people tell us that the preamble, and I've done an episode, I should have had a link to this, but the preamble does not authorize any additional power. It's just explaining the purpose of the delegated power structure of the Constitution. But he called the we the people phrase in the preamble a mere form of words. He explained that while the people were in fact sovereign in the system, they acted not as one uniform mass, but through their existing political societies, the states. Patrick Henry probably most prominently asked, well, who authorizes them to say we the people rather than we the states? And Coxe is actually taking a similar view to Henry, but saying it's okay that they put we the people. The end meaning is the same. Check this out. Maybe I'll have to skim through this because this is pretty long, but it's interesting. He said, first then, though the convention proposed that it should be an act of the people, yet it is in their capacities as citizens of the several members of our confederacy, for they are expressly declared to be the people of the United States, to which idea the expression is strictly confined, and the general term of America, which is constantly used in speaking of us as a nation, is carefully omitted, a pointed view that was evidently had to our existing union. But we must see at once, he said, that the reason of the people being mentioned was that alterations of several constitutions were to be effected, which the convention knew could be done by no authority but that of the people, either determining themselves in several states or delegating adequate powers to state conventions. I guess I'm going to read the whole thing. Had the federal convention meant to exclude the idea of union? So there's a difference. If it's we the people, if it's just the people of an entire country and it's one nationalized blob, that's one thing. It's not an actual union. It's not a united group of states. A union is a group of, well, independent sovereign states uniting for certain limited delegated purposes. He said, had the federal convention meant to exclude the idea of union, that is, of several and separate sovereignties joining in a confederacy, they would have said, we the people of America. For union necessarily involves the idea of component states, which complete consolidations exclude. So he's really hammering home that even though it says we the people, we're not talking about one unified nation. We're talking about a union of separate sovereign states. And he said under the new federal Constitution, so just like under the Articles of Confederation, the Constitution for the United States has the same structure. He said the 13 United States were not intended to be and really are not consolidated in such manner as to absorb or destroy the sovereignties of the several states. And I think this is probably one of the best quotes of his. He said, the unlimited power of the sword, and this is affirming the idea of sovereignty of the people of the states, and actually going beyond the state and federal level, but to the people themselves. But sovereignty is final authority, and that's what he's talking about here when he says the unlimited power of the sword. So the final, ultimate power is not in the hands of either the federal or state governments, but in the hands of the people. Now, he was actually, again, he was kind of all over the place. His father was a loyalist, a stamp collector for a while. He was a loyalist, or at least he was doing business with them. He was charged, arrested. He switched sides during the Revolution. He joined the militia. Then he became a Federalist, and he was even part of the Adams administration, but he didn't hold on to that for long, and he switched sides to the Jeffersonian side. And here from Tara Ross, she says, he became prolific in defending the right to bear arms. Perhaps fittingly, Coxe was later able to serve in the Jefferson administration, outfitting the army and local militias with supplies. He was big on taking action, not just talking about the right to keep and bear arms, but helping effectuate that. He continued this job even after James Madison was elected. Passed away in 1824, but by then he'd left his mark. And this is from Holbrook and Coble. They said, no one in the early republic wrote more about the right to arms, to keep and bear arms, than did Tench Coxe. And this is the kind of foundational stuff that they do not teach in government-run schools, which is why it may be kind of a niche history lesson here today, but I think it's important to get this kind of thing out there and encourage you to read the stuff that I will include in the show notes over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty, so you can make stronger arguments trying to help educate other people on the right position under the Constitution and, of course, eventually what to do about all the problems we have today. But nothing helps us get this kind of work out there and do this type of thing more and more every day than the financial faith and support of our members. You can join us if you want to help us do this and reach and teach more people for as little as $2 a month over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. Again, 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. I do have a quick programming note on Wednesday because my great friend Tom and Jenna are going to be in town. I'm going to be hanging out with them a lot tomorrow. It's likely I will not do a show Wednesday morning, but I might do one Wednesday evening. But I'll post something about it, depending on which platform you're on. I'll schedule the next one as I normally do. But I think I'm probably going to do the Wednesday show rather than the Wednesday morning. I'll probably do it around 6:30 or so Pacific time, Wednesday p.m. But stay tuned on that. I'll have a show one way or the other. Again, 10thamendmentcenter.com/members is where you can support us. You can find all the archives and stuff. Please continue to leave comments in the archive here. I'm running a little bit late, and I got to catch up on a few things, so I will look over in the chat a little bit later today and tomorrow. Those comments do help us spread the word. You can also leave a review on Apple Podcast or any other podcast platform. I hope you enjoyed the episode. I hope you learned something. I hope it piqued your interest to read and learn more. I'll get that blog post for this show published in the next hour or so. Anyways, thank you so much for being here. I hope you had a great Monday so far. I hope you enjoyed this episode. Hope you learned something. I keep saying the same thing. Thanks again. I'll see you next time here on the Path to Liberty.